It may seem like an unusual combination. There is a long history of comedy sci-fi, as we will talk about later. But what are your favorite examples?
So let's start with the most obvious, The Hitchhiker's Guide. I read that when I was a kid. Knee-high to a grasshopper, one of the first books, super easy to get into, relatively thin, so you could finish it in a relatively short time, meaning that younger readers could appreciate it as much as older readers. But it was really older readers that got it, because there was an awful lot more in there rather than just the humorous situations that were first put forward. There was a deep vein of satire running throughout the entirety of it. But if I was to highlight one above them all that as a kid really got to me, and as I grew older realized just how clever it was, it would be Spaceballs of all things. Because Spaceballs does an awful lot more than you expect for your typical spoofy movie, because it is, after all, a movie about consumption. It's a deep satire about Star Wars in particular, but American culture. I mean, spoiler alert! But the whole point of that movie is to stop the Spaceballs literally sucking the life out of the planet with a giant vacuum cleaner. As they go by sucking all of the joy, life, and everything else off the planet, because that's what large franchises do. And if your book is just a spoof of someone else's stuff that you love, inevitably you're starting off from the wrong place. What's your message? What are you trying to say? What's your story? What's going on here? And they often don't have one. The ones that land best are the ones that are actually trying to say something.
When things are really good, we lean into grimdark and we get a lot of dark, gritty. That's when we get the Batman Begins and things like that. And when we have things like pandemics and economic downturns, things like that, people turn to escapism, and comedy is a very great sort of tension relief for people who are looking for escapist entertainment and media. So I think the pendulum is swinging much more towards comedy in recent years, just as a part of that natural reaction of that natural ebb and flow of people wanting to move more into escapism. And the nice thing about comedy is it's escapism with a side of insight. Social insight.
Something that I think sci-fi in particular works really well at, because it's that fish out of water experience of the human condition. Take, for example, Mork and Mindy, a perfect example of that, where Mork comes down and attempts to be human. And by attempting to be human, you realize how ridiculous people are, because they are ridiculous. People do ridiculous things. And then when you actually view it with an outside eye, you're like, wow, we're stupid. Wow, why do we do that? And the observational humor that can come out of that is quite extraordinary.
Because sci-fi comedy can be very high concept, I think it can be hard to maintain, especially with the fish out of water thing. It can be hard to maintain that over the long haul of serialized storytelling, because the fish can only remain out of water for so long before he's just a fish again. I don't know if that made any sense, like from a biological standpoint, but you guys get what I'm saying. Like, he can only be a foreigner. It can only be unfamiliar for so long.
Science fiction is always about the human experience. You know, from Jules Verne and Arthur C. Clarke, what is it like to be a human? How do different peoples in the future tackle the problems of the human condition? And how does that work? And comedy is also about the human condition, like at its most universal, as Andy was saying. It is funny, these things we do as humans. It is very interesting to take a step outside and say, oh, the human condition. Okay, it can be tragic and difficult, but also it can be downright funny. And that's what science fiction has always been about. That's what fantasy has always been about. But that's where the comedy can come in, because we can see that with a pinch of humor rather than with deep dystopian hatred, and it makes it a much more consumable experience. It's a lot easier to consume comedy, even if some of the topics are quite difficult. And I will say, if you're thinking of watching Upload, some of it gets quite heavy at a certain point, and their picture of the future is not rosy. And they could not have made that show consumable unless it was a comedy, because it's too hard to watch any other way. The comedy helps the sci-fi go down in many ways, in my opinion.
The core nature of comedy is about everything that you say, and sci-fi is often basically saying, look, this is where we're heading. Just take a moment. And all the people in the present are like, yeah, no, we're not really. And sci-fi comes along and says, here's a picture of where it could go. And sometimes that picture is exceedingly grim. And while some writers can skillfully pull off a version of it, a 1984 equivalent, putting that forward to an audience in a fully palatable way that entertains that engages, that makes everybody go, this is great. And then when they begin to realize exactly what the underlying messages are, it can hammer it home so much more powerfully than a book that is worthy. The writing of Terry Pratchett, who may be, for example, proliferating his work with so much social commentary and satire, from tip to very toe, often political satire of the moment, which is being repurposed into whichever story is at hand, often more general satire about just the human condition as a whole and where it's generally heading, and commentary about people and what they do when they get into power and how they become, and all of that would be unpalatable and never taught in school in the way that Pratchett spins it, but it is absolutely engaged with it and understood on a fundamental level. And I think that is, in many respects, a far more powerful way to get your messages across than, say, 1984. If you look at Back to the Future, there's a good story in there. It's not just humorous escapades as we go on a big, almost Spielberg-esque adventure. The story that's being told about a kid coming to terms with his parents and the fact that they were kids once too, and his own realization that he's moving into adulthood and what that means.
I'm thinking of Back to the Future 2, where their vision of 2015 was a little off. And some of the humor was also really dated. So when you put the dated sci-fi, the dated projections for the future with equally dated humor references, it multiplies how rough that can be later, and how poorly it ages.
There is a really important thing with comedy, and it is knowing your audience. And I feel like the Orville course corrected. Some of the humor was not very smart humor. And then they realized that the Venn diagram of people who like Star Trek and the Venn diagram of people who like humor tends towards people who like smarter humor. And all of a sudden, the jokes got more sophisticated, slightly more sciencey, slightly more within the spirit of the thing. And all of a sudden, for me, for whom I am like right in the middle of that Venn diagram of somebody who is absolutely a Trekkie since I was 5 and absolutely loves comedy, that was perfect for me. Comedy is so subjective, and it's more important for comedy than any other kind of genre to know your audience, because if you get it wrong, it's simply not funny. Make sure that you check things, make sure you are not punching down to people, make sure that you are careful with your jokes, and don't consistently make one person the butt of the jokes unless it's actually going to be funny, not tragic and sad.
That's why satire works so well, because you're generally pricking at the bubble of power and looking at that, which has all of the ability to make the decisions, and saying, yeah, but should they? And what are they actually doing?
You know, the opportunities of sci-fi and comedy where you can use it to have the bouncing ball, to have the ups and the downs, and you know, make the audience guess what's going to come next. But make sure that in doing that, you're not, you know, foisted by your own petard. You don't end up deflating your own balloon and making something less impactful than it could be because you made a silly joke at the wrong time.
I think a really good example of that, you want to see it in practice on the TV, because that's easily consumable, is The Good Place. Something that used humor end to end, almost non-stop. But every time those dramatic moments came up, every time those deeply emotional moments came up, they gave them the space that was required to breathe.
They also did a great job of balancing highbrow very intellectual, like deep philosophical humor with like the lowest lowbrow comedy imaginable. All of their jokes were either like incredibly dumb or like you needed basically a master's degree to fully get the joke. I still don't know how they managed to pull that off.
Well, that was deep philosophy and human existential crisis blended with comedy, because the comedy makes it more palatable.
The opportunity that sci-fi offers, where you can view the human condition from the outside through one fashion or another, and allow people to understand something about themselves in a way that they wouldn't before, and then allow them to realize how ridiculous they are, allows everything to be a little bit easier. It allows it all to land in a way that hard sci-fi that doesn't rely on its humor to do that can sometimes become across as very difficult to read, or very worthy, or very, yeah, I see what you're trying to do. Stop hitting me in the face with a stick.